In today's global world, air travel is vital. Customers should expect a good service, though. Also, safety, reliability, accountability. But let's face it, that's not the reality these days. Every day, flights are delayed, they're canceled, there's poor customer service, there's high prices, not to mention having to pay now for seats, bags, boarding passes. The list goes on and on. So joining us today is Alex Whalen. He is Director of Atlantic Canada Prosperity with the Fraser Institute and co-author of the study, Clearing the Runway: Reforms to Enhance Air Travel Competition in Canada. Good to have you with us today, Alex. Welcome.
Hi there, great to be with you.
Okay, so Alex, how bad is the situation with Canada's air travel industry? How do we compare when measured against, say, US or European air carriers and the rest of the world?
Well, according to the objective data we have, it's quite bad. If you ask Canadians, and our large national polling firms have done that, two-thirds of Canadians, when polled, say that they think that Canada's system of air travel is broken. The federal government, a few years ago in 2018, 2019, set up a complaints registry for air passenger complaints. Complaints have increased sixfold. And then when you look at price, one international comparison of prices placed Canada 101st out of 116 countries when it comes to price competitiveness. So Canadians are not happy with their options.
No, definitely. I fly a lot, and I would definitely be on that list of people that are kind of dissatisfied lately. Flying used to be so fun. It is just not fun anymore. So, Alex, your study lists 4 separate fees that make it more expensive to fly from Canada, and one is airport improvement fees. So what does this fee encompass, and should passengers be footing the bill for this?
Airport improvement fees are applied on every ticket in Canada, and that is money that goes back to the airport authorities to fund their operations. The Canada exists broadly when it comes to fees on a user pay system, but what we've identified is that when it comes to airport improvement fees and a number of other fees, they tend to be much higher in Canada. For example, a typical airport in Canada may charge an airport improvement fee of about $30 per ticket. And what we've seen in comparative countries like the United States is that it's simply a fraction of that amount, down as low as $5 or $6 per ticket, for example.
$30 is high when you consider the amount of volume of passengers going through. I mean, my goodness, I know we're a smaller country than the US population-wise, but $30, that really, yeah, that adds up for sure. So second on your list is air traffic control fees. So what is all this about?
Yeah, so air traffic control fees must be paid to fund Canada's system of air traffic control. In Canada, we have a corporation called NAV Canada that handles air traffic control in the country. This is actually one segment of air policy where there's a bit of good news in the sense that air traffic control was privatized in Canada in the 1990s, and that system seems to work fairly well. The one area that we've pointed out when it comes to air traffic control is that some of the comparisons internationally show that Canada is a high-cost jurisdiction. So going back to what we were discussing earlier, when you look at all these different forms of fees, we see a situation where Canada is often uncompetitive.
Yeah, I mean, air traffic control, I mean, it's definitely important, but I mean, it's interesting when we start breaking down and realizing that we're paying fees for it. So a third is air travel security charges. What does that mean?
So air travel security charges are a form of charge that came in after 9/11. Understandably, there was much concern around security at that time, and to be super clear, obviously, security is something that everybody wants to see. But what we have noticed when we dug into these security charges is that actually the latest available data suggests that security charges are being collected in excess of what's required to actually fund the security operations, and have actually resulted in a remittance to the federal government. So we've identified that as one area where fees are actually being collected in excess of what's required, and obviously that contributes to the cost of tickets.
And then fourth is airport landing fees. What on earth is that all about?
Landing fees are charged by airports based on a number of factors, including size and weight of planes, and they go towards funding airport operations. Once again, it can be things like gate fees, parking fees, and so on. And again, when we look at international comparisons, it's just another area where fees in Canada seem to be higher than elsewhere in the world. And I do want to stress that it's important to understand the model of air travel policy in Canada, which is user fees. So it's not surprising that we see fees. I think the important part is to zoom in on where Canada's fees are uncompetitive and where they're higher than they need to be. Because ultimately, when we look at the overall cost of air travel, what we're seeing is that Canada is a very expensive place to travel.
Yeah, what are all these fees telling us? Like, what does this tell you when you're looking at, when you're kind of digging into all of this?
Well, when you zoom out and put it all together, I mean, I would point to a couple data points. First off, what we see is in Canada, taxes and fees represent upwards of 30% of the total cost of air travel. So that's one data point. And then, not surprisingly, when we look at a country like the United States, we see that air travel charges are generally about 30 to 35% lower. Now, there are all kinds of important differences between the two systems, and it's not as simple as that. But in general, the available data tells us that Canada is a high-cost jurisdiction and that consumers are paying for that.
But why? Why is it higher?
So we've gone through the different types of fees. There are a number of other policy decisions, mostly by the federal government, that increase the cost of air travel. One example would be Canada's model of airport ownership. The federal government of Canada transferred airport ownership to private not-for-profit operators in the 1990s, but the federal government still actually owns the land under Canada's airports and collects rents accordingly. So the federal government is effectively profiting off the system on a yearly basis. That would be another example of what is contributing to the high cost of air travel. And then, in addition to fees and rents that I've discussed, it's important to note that there are other general taxes, not specific to the airline industry, that tend to be higher in Canada than some other countries. When we look at things like sales taxes, fuel taxes, corporate taxes, and so on, it all contributes to the cost of.
So obviously you would like to see these fees and taxes lowered, as would we all, but what's stopping the government from doing this?
Well, that's a good question. I think what we are seeing in recent years is a shift. I think Canadians are broadly pretty unhappy with the state of air policy in Canada. And I think ultimately, when Canadians demand change, the federal government will react. When we look at federal policy right now, obviously, it's a time of great change in our country. I think we need wholesale policy reform in a whole number of different areas. And I think that Canadians would be quite pleased if the federal government implemented reforms in this area.
Now, the report says Canada has a particularly high regulatory burden for airlines, and you suggest this needs to be reduced. So, what kinds of changes could be implemented, and would this potentially affect safety?
First, I think it's important to understand that every regulation that is added to any industry adds to the cost of that industry. So it's imperative for the government to remove unnecessary regulation. Everybody agrees that we need to travel safely when it comes to all modes of transportation. But we actually looked at a case study in our essay of the United States, which had a highly regulated air industry up until about the 1970s. And the United States undertook a really fascinating deregulation project. And what we see when we study the experience of deregulation in the United States is that airline competition improved, prices improved, choice for consumers improved. But the important part is that the safety record actually improved as well. So sensible regulatory reform does not need to mean that we sacrifice safety.
Yeah, deregulation, it meant more competition. It meant that it kept those airlines on their toes as well, for sure. Now, you had mentioned before the airport ownership is kind of an issue with the land that it sits on. So the ownership structure. So apparently Canadian airports are government owned, which I guess most of us didn't really think about that. At least I didn't. Other countries often have private or for-profit airports. So how would this make a difference for us if we followed this type of model?
That's right. So, I mean, Canada's airports are operated by not-for-profits, but the federal government still owns the land and collects rent on the land. And so this is another form of restriction of competition. And really, that's the theme of our discussion today is that Canada's skies need to be open to competition, whether that's more airports, whether that's different types of operators. There are a whole number of different federal policies that restrict competition. And at the end of the day, that creates monopoly power for existing providers and tends to raise prices. So certainly changing in the model to bring in private for-profit ownership of airports would be an important reform.
Yeah, and Canada has some strict limitations placed on foreign air carriers operating within Canada, which does contribute to a lack of competition and high ticket prices in our air travel industry, like you were saying there. So should these limits be lifted? And, why would the government be concerned about allowing more competition?
Absolutely. In this study, we propose that Canada open up the skies to foreign competition. Obviously, we want that to be with trusted countries and within a proper security regime. But I'll point to the experience of Europe, which eliminated a set of rules known as cabotage. And cabotage basically restricts where airlines can fly. And that allows new entrants to come into the market. One study looking at the elimination or reduction of cabotage in Europe actually found that prices were reduced by 34% in the years that followed. That's the type of reform that I think we need in Canada.
Yeah, for sure. Why would the government be concerned about this, though? Like,
Well, I think the government should be concerned because Canadians are concerned. I mean, going back to where we started, we've seen a six-fold increase in complaints to the federal government about the state of air travel in Canada. And just in general, I think it's important for our federal government to understand where they have a role to play and where they need to get out of the way, create a more competitive environment and allow the private sector to flourish. And I think that's true across many different industries right now, but perhaps nowhere is that more true than air travel.
yeah, for sure. And I think we'd all love to see more customer choice and lower prices in our airlines for sure. So, what will it take to convince our federal government to bring some of these changes about?
Well, selfishly, I hope our study sets off a bit of a conversation, but I think that conversation is already going on. And like I said, there will be a lot of change in the federal government over the next couple of years. So I think if consumer complaints keep piling up, we have a bit of a blueprint here in terms of how to improve Canada's air travel policy.
Yeah, for sure. Is there a reason why the federal government would be concerned about letting these other competitive airlines in, or I mean, why are they doing this? I guess is the question.
Yes, I think it's important first to understand that there are certain aspects of policy that we've discussed today where the federal government is actually profiting. So they have an incentive to maintain the status quo, but hopefully through some awareness, we can see the benefits of changing that policy. When it comes to bringing foreign carriers into Canada, I do think there's a security component there that needs to be evaluated. But countries all over the world have bilateral and multilateral agreements that allow foreign carriers to operate within their borders safely. As I say, that's done elsewhere, and there's no reason that couldn't be done safely in Canada.
Yeah, such an interesting study that you're diving into there. But thanks so much for sharing this information with us today, Alex. Appreciate having you on.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed the chat.
Absolutely. Alex Whalen is the co-author of the study Clearing the Runway: Reforms to Enhance Air Travel Competition in Canada, which you can read online at thefraserinstitute.org.